Hello again, and welcome back to Shorts in Psychology. This is the first video on the personality topic series, and today we're going to be talking about all things Freud, in particular his theory regarding the structure of personality. Sigmund Freud was the founding father of psychoanalysis, a method used to explain human behavior and treat mental illness. Freud believed that life was built around tension and pleasure. He believed that all tension was due to the build-up of libido, or sexual energy, and that all pleasure came from its discharge. According to Freud, the unconscious mind was a storehouse for unacceptable, repressed desires specific to the individual, and that past experiences, particularly in childhood, have a great influence on our adult lives, shaping our personality. For example, anxiety originating from traumatic experiences in a person's past is hidden from consciousness and may cause problems during adulthood in the form of neuroses such as melancholia, hysteria, or obsessive or compulsive behaviors. Freud believed the human psyche was composed of three elements. The conscious mind contains ideas, thoughts, and feelings of which we are aware, and this makes up 10% of our psyche. 50 to 60% of the psyche is the sub- or preconscious mind, which contains material that can easily be recalled, such as what we did last weekend. The remaining 30 to 40% of the psyche is the unconscious mind, which is well below the surface of awareness and contains repressed memories, traumatic experiences, unacceptable urges, and all of our primitive instincts and desires. According to Freud, there are three basic structures of personality: the id, the ego, and the superego. These three elements work together to create complex behaviors and have a powerful influence on individuals. Each of these three elements of personality emerge at different points in life. Although each part of the personality comprises unique features, they interact to form a whole, and each part makes relative contribution to an individual's behavior. The id is the only component of personality present at birth and is entirely unconscious. Freud called it a cauldron of seething excitement, as it is the irrational component of personality that seeks immediate satisfaction of instinctual urges and desires, regardless of the consequences, and it's ruled by the pleasure principle. It is the primitive and instinctual part of the mind that consists of all the inherited or biological components of personality, including sexual and aggressive drives. If the needs of the id are not satisfied immediately, a state of anxiety or tension results. The id is impulsive and responds immediately to the instincts. The personality of a newborn child is all id, and only later does it develop an ego and superego. Imagine trying to convince a baby to wait until lunchtime to eat its meal. Instead, the id requires immediate satisfaction, and because the other components of personality are not yet present, the infant will cry until these needs are fulfilled. Although people eventually learn to control the id via the ego, the id remains infantile in its function throughout a person's life, and does not change with time or experience, as it is not in touch with the external world. The id is not affected by reality, logic, or the everyday world, as it operates within the unconscious part of the mind. Freud said that the ego is the part of the id which has been modified by the direct influence of the external world. It develops to mediate between the unrealistic id and the external real world, hence it operates according to the reality principle. It is the partly conscious, rational, decision-making component of personality that regulates thoughts and behavior. Ideally, the ego works by reason, whereas the id is chaotic and unreasonable. The ego considers social realities and norms, etiquette and rules in deciding how to behave. It works out realistic ways of satisfying the id's demands in a manner acceptable in the real world. In many cases, the id's impulses can be satisfied through a process of delayed gratification. The ego will eventually allow the behavior, but only in the appropriate time and place. Freud made the analogy of the id being a horse, while the ego is the rider. The ego is like a man on horseback who has to hold in check the superior strength of the horse. For example, imagine that you are stuck in a long meeting at work. You find yourself growing increasingly hungry as the meeting drags on. While the id might compel you to jump up from your seat and rush to the break room for a snack, the ego guides you to sit quietly and wait for the meeting to end. Instead of acting upon the primal urges of the id, you spend the rest of the meeting imagining yourself eating a cheeseburger. Once the meeting is finally over, you can seek out the object you were imagining and satisfy the demands of the id in a realistic and appropriate manner. The last component of personality to develop is the superego, which emerges around age 5. It is the partly conscious, self-evaluative and moralistic component of personality that is formed through the internalization of parental and societal rules. The superego provides guidelines for making judgments and focuses on how we ought to behave. The superego acts to perfect and civilize our behavior, working to suppress all unacceptable urges of the id. It struggles to make the ego act upon idealistic standards rather than upon realistic principles. The superego consists of two systems, the conscience and the ideal self. The conscience can punish the ego through causing feelings of guilt. For example, if the ego gives in to the id's demands, the superego may make the person feel bad through guilt. The ideal self, or ego ideal, is an imaginary picture of how you ought to be and represents career aspirations, how to treat other people, and how to behave as a member of society. When talking about the id, the ego, and the superego, it is important to remember that these are not three totally separate entities with clearly defined boundaries. These aspects of personality are dynamic and always interacting within a person to influence an individual's overall personality and behavior. If the ego is able to adequately moderate between the demands of the reality, the id, and the superego, a healthy and well-adjusted personality emerges. Freud believed that an imbalance between these elements would lead to a maladaptive personality. An individual with an overly dominant id, for example, might become impulsive, uncontrollable, or even criminal. This individual acts upon his or her most basic urges with no concern for whether the behavior is appropriate, acceptable, or legal. An overly dominant superego, on the other hand, might lead to a personality that is extremely moralistic and possibly judgmental. This person may be very unable to accept anything or anyone that he or she perceives as bad or immoral. An excessively dominant ego can also result in problems. An individual with this type of personality might be so tied to reality, rules, and appropriateness that they are unable to engage in any type of spontaneous or unexpected behavior. This individual may seem very concrete and rigid, incapable of accepting change, and lacking an internal sense of right from wrong. It is easy to see how conflict might arise between the id, ego, and superego. When the ego is unable to deal with the demands of the id, constraints of reality, and the moral standards of the superego, an unpleasant inner state of anxiety arises. This anxiety acts as a signal to the ego that things are not going the way they should. As a result, the ego employs defense mechanisms to help reduce these feelings of anxiety. Let's summarize some of the defense mechanisms the ego may employ to alleviate anxiety. Repression acts to keep information out of conscious awareness. However, these memories don't just disappear, they continue to influence our behavior. For example, a person who has repressed memories of abuse suffered as a child may later have difficulty forming relationships. Denial is probably one of the best known defense mechanisms and is an outright refusal to admit or recognize that something has occurred or is currently occurring. In many cases, there might be overwhelming evidence that something is true, yet the person will continue to deny its existence or truth because it is too uncomfortable to face. Denial can involve a flat-out rejection of the existence of a fact or reality. In other cases, it might involve admitting that something is true, but minimizing its importance. Sometimes people will accept reality and the seriousness of the fact, but they will deny their own responsibility and instead blame other people or other outside forces. Drug addicts or alcoholics often deny that they have a problem, while victims of traumatic events may deny that the event ever occurred. Projection is a defense mechanism that involves taking our own unacceptable qualities or feelings and ascribing them to other people. For example, if you have a strong dislike for someone, you might instead believe that he or she does not like you. Projection works by allowing the expression of the desire or impulse, but in a way that the ego cannot recognize, therefore reducing anxiety. Rationalization is a defense mechanism that involves explaining an unacceptable behavior or feeling in a rational or logical manner, avoiding the true reasons for the behavior. For example, a person who is turned down for a date might rationalize the situation by saying they were not attracted to the other person anyway. A student might blame a poor exam score on the instructor rather than his or her lack of preparation. Rationalization not only prevents anxiety, it may also protect self-esteem and self-concept. When confronted by success or failure, people tend to attribute achievement to their own qualities and skills, while failures are blamed on other people or outside forces. Displacement involves taking out our frustrations, feelings, and impulses on people or objects that are less threatening. Displaced aggression is a common example of this defense mechanism. Rather than express our anger in ways that could lead to negative consequences, like arguing with our boss, we instead express our anger towards a person or object that poses no threat, such as our spouse, children, or pets. Reaction formation reduces anxiety by taking up the opposite feeling, impulse, or behavior. An example of reaction formation would be treating someone you strongly dislike in an excessively friendly manner in order to hide your true feelings. When confronted by stressful events, people sometimes abandon coping strategies and revert to patterns of behavior used in earlier development. This defense mechanism is called regression. For example, an individual fixated at an earlier developmental stage might cry or sulk upon hearing unpleasant news. Finally, sublimation is a defense mechanism that allows us to act out unacceptable impulses by converting these behaviors into a more acceptable form. For example, a person experiencing extreme anger might take up kickboxing as a means of venting frustration. Freud believed that sublimation was a sign of maturity that allows people to function normally in socially acceptable ways. Let's finish by applying Freud's theories to a few past exam questions. Pause the video while you take a moment to complete this question. As I've mentioned in class, the exam will never ask specifically for Freud, as other psychodynamic theories could be taught to students. However, in your case, you can describe any of Freud's theories relating to personality, including his levels of consciousness, unconscious, subconscious, and conscious, structure of personality, id, ego, superego, psychostages of development, or defense mechanisms. As the question is worth 6 marks, you just need to have 3 ideas well described relating to one of these. This is probably easiest to achieve by describing either the levels of consciousness or structure of personality, and this is often where students have the most success. In this question, you need to apply the theory to a scenario about Amanda. Pause the video while you answer the question. This question asks you to describe one aspect of a psychodynamic theory of personality. So this means that 2 marks are for the description of this aspect, and 2 marks are for your description of how Amanda's characteristics illustrate this aspect. Therefore, rather than describing all 3 elements of personality, you need to choose one. For example, you may describe the id and how characteristics of Amanda's personality, such as the fact that she is self-centered and makes decisions based on emotions rather than facts, is evidence that her personality is dominated by her id rather than ego or superego. Similarly, you could choose to describe the unconscious mind and Amanda's unconscious drives, including her being talkative and making decisions based on emotion rather than facts. To conclude, let's look at an extended response question. In this video, we are just going to answer the first dot point, which is worth 4 marks, so you will need 2 well-described points as your answer. Pause the video while you do this. This question has a lot of material that you could use in your answer here. As for the other questions we've looked at, you could describe any of Freud's theories relating to personality. However, in this video, I'm going to focus on characteristics that relate to the 3 components of personality: id, ego, and superego. You only have to choose 2 characteristics listed, and these could both relate to the same component or different components. So, for example, you may explain how 2 characteristics are illustrative of the id component, or 1 of the id component and 1 of the superego. Phrases listed that could describe an id-dominant personality include childish, rebellious, repressed memories, pleasure seeker, instinctive, or hostile. 3 examples of phrases that describe the ego are extremely rational, sensitive, and overly efficient. The superego could be described as controlling, critical, always feels guilty, and moralistic. There are also many phrases here that related well to the psychosexual stages of development, so we will return to this question in the next video. Hopefully, though, this has given you a good introduction to some of Freud's psychodynamic theories relating to personality. As always, thanks for listening.